The following video podcast is a presentation of Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum.
One of the things you mentioned was Marshall and the Supreme Court. And obviously the Supreme Court has had what I would call a pretty nefarious role when it comes to protecting the Constitution that our founders gave us. And that goes back to the fact that realistically they think that they can interpret the Constitution and decide what's constitutional and what's not, when in essence they are a party to that original agreement. Yeah. And if you give them a blank check to interpret the Constitution, you're basically giving the federal government a blank check as well.
Right, and that was Jefferson's whole point in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, that if the federal government has a monopoly on interpreting its powers, it's just going to interpret the Constitution ever more expansively and discover more and more powers. Well, he just told the history of the 20th century right there in that one line. So his own view was that there should be concurrent review, that if a measure passes muster of all three branches, the President, the Congress, and the Supreme Court think it's constitutional, then that's one thing. But it was his view, for example, that a president could say, I don't care that the Supreme Court says something's constitutional. If I think it isn't, I'm not obligated to sign it. My own judgment can be, no, they're wrong, this is unconstitutional, and I veto it. So he favored a much more robust safeguard, which would be all three branches, but he also believed, as Madison echoed in the report of 1800, that in the last resort, the states have to be the final arbiters. They, having been the creators of the thing, I mean, who ever heard of a situation where one person or a group of people creates something, and then they let their own creation dictate back to them? I mean, the Frankenstein monster is not supposed to tell Dr. Frankenstein what to do. Like, that's not the natural order of things.
Well, that's what we have now.
And of course, that is what happened in the Frankenstein, so at least the modern version of the Frankenstein story, right.
So and you bring up an interesting point again, is if the president feels that something is unconstitutional, then he should, if he's a moral and upstanding president, he should say, look, I don't care what you guys want to do, this really is not constitutional.
Right.
That's somewhat similar to the principle of jury nullification, is it not?
Yeah, where the jurors would say, in our judgment, there's something wrong with the law to start with. I mean, jury nullification is where a jury will say, it can be all different. It can be, in this, the law is okay, but in this case, it would be a travesty of justice to apply it, or the law is itself unjust, and so we have to overrule this, or it's unconstitutional. And that's another safeguard, because I know that in our civics textbooks we read that the people make the laws, but let's face it, behind closed doors lawyers make the laws, and we have to live with them. So the one way that you can really have the people have some kind of input is with this tremendous negative known as jury nullification. And the thing is that the framers of the Constitution seem to have taken for granted. Now, they weren't all enthusiastic about it, but they all took for granted that this was a power of juries to judge not just the facts of the case, but also the law.
In colonial times, when the Constitution was written, I think people were a lot more involved in their government, a lot more involved in legislation and in talking with the people who represented them. And of course, the people who represented them lived among them. They were not some elite class in Washington, D.C., which
right.
is what the Congress has evolved into, and the executive branch have evolved into.
Initially, they wanted to limit representation. They wanted to say that there'd be one member of the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people. And then, now, I mean, of course, your state rep, you could very easily know your state rep could live on your street. But even your representative in the U.S. Congress, 30,000 to 1 is not preposterously large. Today, it's about 750,000 to 1, and I bet in our lifetimes it'll get to 1 million people represented by one person. How could that, by one congressman, and forget about the senators, but one congressman represents 1 million people? it is hard for people to have their voice heard in that situation.
Well, you know, with the Senate, I mean, the 17th Amendment is obviously something that completely disconnected the purpose of the Senate from what the framers intended.
Well, of course, if you're going to have both the Senate and the House elected by the same method, what's the point in having two different, what is this, we just want another group of people elected in exactly the same way to look at the same...
That are there even longer?
Yeah, right. Like, what? Obviously, there was a reason they... Yeah, there's such a lack of curiosity, unfortunately, in a lot of traditional classrooms, where everybody feels superior to the framers or whatever. They were too stupid to know that, of course, you need popular election of senators, or they were too stupid. They don't stop... let me try and at least do them the courtesy of figuring out why they thought that way, why they thought that it would be better for the senator to be, in effect, like a representative of his state and to vote in that way, instead of the situation today where the senator flies around the country to half a dozen influential cities, raises all the money he needs, and votes any old way.
I think I remember in the last election, the senator from Connecticut who was defeated, I think he only got $500 from the state, and all the rest of his money was from around the country.
Yeah. How is that an improvement?
Well, and how could he represent his state?
Right.
He, as far as he was concerned, he is in no way beholden to the state itself, which is what the framers intended. You know, we have in North Carolina, and certainly in many other states, we have state legislatures who are nullification deniers. They just go along with the flow and they say, no, it is not constitutional. What's the best way to approach that?
Well, I have a couple of, I'll answer your question, but I also want to add that I have a couple of resources on this. I have a frequently asked questions on nullification, because I found that the same questions keep coming up. So it took me 2.5 years to figure out, why don't you put up a frequently asked question? So I bought the domain name nullificationfaq.com. And then I also have a blog post you can Google, is nullification unconstitutional? And I go through and now I've got a lengthy answer, but that's not really what you need. You need something pithy. And then if you get them,
well, you know, you're talking about people who have an attention span of about 5 minutes.
Right.
If you're lucky.
I can do it in 5 minutes, but you can give them, but there are quick ones. First of all, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times the people who will tell you that nullification is unconstitutional are people who, if you gave them 100 years, they couldn't find anything unconstitutional. You know, like it seems suspicious to me that all of a sudden, the only thing that's unconstitutional is us resisting them. Now that you can't do. However, name, whatever the federal government does, there's no constitutional problem with any of those things. Well, there are a couple of ways of answering. One is the ratifying conventions, because remember, that's the key to understanding the Constitution. Well, what do we see in Virginia's ratifying convention? We actually see a future state attorney general whose job it was to explain to America what Virginia's interpretation of the Constitution was. He said at the ratifying convention, don't worry everybody, it's a limited government, and if they try to do anything that's not listed in this document, Virginia will just be exonerated from it.
Will secede.
Oh, they even said that they could secede ultimately.
Well, secession is really, if you believe in state sovereignty.
You have to believe in that.
And if you believe that the Constitution is a compact among sovereign states,
yeah,
what's wrong with secession?
No other position makes sense. Right, you would have to believe in that.